MYOTROPICS.
So this is a summary of what you can expect predictably if you access these higher intakes of protein. And this is just protein now. We're not talking about the nuanced differentials that come from selecting dairy, for example. First, increased thermogenesis by multiple mechanisms. As we said, the energy equation, energy expenditure has thermogenesis as a primary component. You get increased 24-hour energy spent, increased fat oxidation, increased fat-free mass at the expense of your fat mass, and you get enhanced fat mass losses and marked sparing of your lean tissue when you do restrict energy. And when do you do that? Well, when you're preparing for a show, you can't help but restrict energy. You get a significant mitigation of fat mass regain following that period of energy, and you get profound satiety. So these are the benefits that are direct and substantive when you increase your energy from protein to 30 to 40%. Next slide. This is how this is going on. This is an example or a chart of the intracellular apparatus that drives muscle protein synthesis and the nutrient effects. Next slide. When you're training in the gym, this is manifest as follows. The muscle obviously is getting neural input from the central nervous system that drives the electrical energy to make muscle contraction a reality. These electrical signals are transferred to a voltage sensor that lies just beneath the cell membrane of the muscle cell. Here you can see the neurotransmitters being converted to electrical energy and gaining access to the interior of the muscle cells through these tunnels, which are called T-tubules. Now we'll look at the individual muscle cell. The membrane has receptor systems for nutrients, growth factors, and for the stretch receptors that are activated with weight training. Stretch receptors on the right are the yellow. So when you train with weights, the mechanical signal is transduced from the membrane to a compound called phosphatidic acid, and then to this nodal point of control, which we call mTOR, which then phosphorylates a sort of floor manager called S6 to increase muscle protein synthesis and growth. Same thing happens with nutrients. They gain access through selective pathways to mTOR. mTOR phosphorylates downstream to S6, and protein synthesis and growth happen. You have growth factors like, for example, insulin. Same picture. They enter and through a relay type mechanism affect the intracellular components one at a time and essentially gain access to the final common pathway and produce more protein. The actual floor manager of this, as I said, was mTOR, and mTOR is an interesting molecule that has to be activated, has specific components, and that red component is kind of like a parking brake. Any nutrient ingestion that will stimulate that little AKT, which could be amino acids, carbohydrates, once AKT is activated, it takes off the parking brake, the mTOR complex becomes unlocked, and it's a position ready to be activated. Amino acids are particularly effective at this, cause a rearrangement of two things, activate the lysosome, which moves over. AKT inactivates those, which activates Reb. Reb moves over, and now you've got a viable complex that's active and ready to transduce the signal into a protein synthetic increase. So that phosphorylation occurs, and you now look at the factory itself and what happens inside a muscle cell. This is a simulated factory with mTOR being the floor manager. What mTOR does is increase the efficiency of translation, which is much like an assembly line. The orange things are essentially individual amino acids being linked end on end to promote or to produce complete proteins. With the appropriate signal from an external source that is delivered effectively to the cell, in terms of we need more protein, the mTOR complex essentially sends its signal to the effector, which is S6, to essentially speed up the rate at which proteins are assembled. And that signal is sustained after an effective dose of protein for only about 3 hours in the case of a 25-gram dose of whey. So one of the things that has evolved is that if you want to synergize the mTOR stimulation by the weight training stimulus, you could take a 25-gram pop of whey immediately after and get that effect. Okay, next slide. Now, the timing of your protein intake, therefore, is critical because we've got this mechanism in effect for a 3-hour window. And on the right is the typical distribution in the American diet as it exists right now. And as you can see, the skew is tremendous, such that most of the protein that Americans consume is at night. The way to drive your muscle protein synthesis factory and gain all of those benefits that we articulated is to move protein evenly throughout the day so that the consumptions are even. Next step, next slide. Your exercise prescription recapitulates all of these things, basically increasing lean mass at the expense of fat mass, and different forms of exercise are more or less effective at this. The next slide. A typical aerobic conditioning program, one that's actually pretty vigorous, fails to do either of these things. They fail to increase energy expenditure on a 24-hour basis significantly, and they don't do anything for fat oxidation. Whereas in the next slide, even minimal resistance training, and this is a protocol with essentially 1 set, 9 exercises, 3 times a week. As you can see, substantial increases in energy expenditure and substantial increases in fat oxidation. The next slide. And with conventional training, which is multi-set, multiple times a week, you get even more magnificent changes in all of these variables, energy expenditure and fat oxidation. Next step. If you add low-volume, high-intensity interval training to this as opposed to classical aerobic conditioning, you get a further increase in fat oxidation. Next slide. So the big 3 that we've learned here today that will guide you in your physique enhancement are first and foremost that low-calorie manipulation to try and dissipate body fat actually might make you fat. That's the ultimate sort of, whoops, you know, I've done something inadvertent. Number 2 is that metabolic advantage, that is more weight loss, more energy, more free energy dissipated at higher caloric intakes and more efficient acquisition of lean tissue can only be accomplished by optimizing protein. When I say optimize protein, engage a high protein diet. What is a high protein diet? Well, a high protein diet to me is anything in excess of 30% energy is protein. And that's hard to do. But I can tell you, after years and years and years of working with very accomplished professional bodybuilders in the 90s, the levels you're talking about that get the maximal effect are upwards of 400 grams a day. Now, there's one way you can do that and one way only. You have to drink half of it. And drinking half of it is a good thing because you can drink dairy proteins. And last but not least, effective resistance training with or without a high-intensity interval component recapitulates exactly the metabolic changes, the metabolic regulatory changes that are produced by a metabolic advantage diet. So this is the solution to the obesity problem in 3 simple steps. You have to abandon low-calorie intake as a method of affecting your body fat mass. It doesn't work, and it has pervasive, maladaptive consequences. Number 2, you want to engage metabolic advantage, you have to become an inefficient processor of nutrient. To do that, you need to optimize protein intake, which means aggressively increasing your intake levels in excess of 200 grams per day. Third, the only form of exercise which will truly synergize these concepts is resistance training with possibly an added component of high-intensity interval. So if you have limited time resources, the way to exercise is with resistance training and stop doing low, slow, long duration aerobic conditioning programs. So that's kind of the the program for tonight. Dave, do we have time for questions, or are we?
Dan, you got a question? We have Danny Hester here, top NPC competitor for longer than I competed, I think.
Yeah, I just want to know what the adverse effect of like a lot of protein would be, because that's, I think, everyone's question, especially with kidney problems and stuff like that these days.
The major fallacies about the hazards of high protein intake are essentially three. One is a disturbance of acid-base balance because of the lack of alkalinizing carbohydrate in the diet. Number two, the potential negative consequences that that would have on leaching elemental calcium from the bone and producing weakened bones, and an illusory concept of impaired kidney function, which has come from animal studies in which the dietary protein level has a discernible impact in rodent models, but is a species-specific phenomenon. Recently, there was a very comprehensive study done in Korea on Korean professional bodybuilders. The average protein intake in that sample was 430 grams per day. They could detect zero adverse consequences at that level of intake. If you can get to 430 grams a day, you're a star. And there is objective evidence that at least in humans at that level intake, there is no discernible adverse effect.
I've been torturing Scott for about 10 years, ever since he sold Metrics, to come out with a new product. And I know Vince has been also nudging him in the gut for about another 5 on top of that. And we finally got Scott to come out with a new product. His new company, MYOTROPICS Physique Nutrition, is out now. And the newest product, Physique 2.0, which is the newest meal replacement shake. You got to take, guys, you got to try this stuff. This is phenomenal. Scott, I'm going to mix up some of these very unique samples you got. This little device will screw onto the top of any water bottle, and it drops the powder into the liquid. And you just shake it up, and you can drink it. They're pretty cool. Scott, well, I'm going to mix up a couple of these, and if you guys want to come up and get some free samples, I'll give them out to you. Scott, explain what's I guess the key points of this new product.
Well, again, if your goal is to enhance body composition in the direction of more lean mass and less fat mass, there really is only one strategy that you need to follow. And the nutritional constituents that affect that strategy are all contained in this product.
Once again, if you missed the seminar and you want to see it, we'll have it on rxmuscle.com. And I want to thank MYOTROPICS Physique Nutrition not only for sponsoring rxmuscle.com in this seminar, but for also sponsoring the sport of men's physique. They're one of the only companies that have really gotten behind it, and they already have signed on several athletes. Guys, if you're interested in being sponsored by MYOTROPICS, you can always contact Vince Andrich or Scott. Right now, we got to clear the theater so John could sell some tickets for tonight's show, and we can get out of here before, what, midnight, John?